So we've talked about the mens rea. I want to turn now to the procedures. Procedurally, the crime of solicitation is complete upon the request that's accompanied by the specific intent. There is no requirement that the other person has to say yes or that the crime take place. The request, the ask, the encouraging, with the accompanying specific intent is sufficient for the crime of solicitation. I want you to pause the movie at the moment of that request, and as long as it's accompanied by the required specific intent, solicitation is complete. Let's continue now with a look at the procedural posture as the movie continues. In our very first example involving John and Al, if Al says, "Yes, I will kill your wife," John's solicitation to commit murder now turns in to the crime of conspiracy, which is an agreement between two or more guilty persons to commit a crime. Al saying yes forged that agreement. It started with John's asking him and Al's confirming that he would do it. Because of that, we say that the crime of solicitation merges into the conspiracy if the other person agrees. That's because solicitation is really kind of an attempted conspiracy. Once it can be proven that a conspiracy occurred, there's no more need for the crime of solicitation. In fact, one would never be convicted of both solicitation and conspiracy. Could be charged with both and let the jury decide, but could never be convicted of both. In that sense, solicitation is on the same footing as an attempt crime. One might be charged with an attempted robbery and a completed robbery, but one could never be convicted of robbery and attempted robbery for the same theft. It's one or the other, and the attempt merges into the completed offense. It's only if the other person rebuffs defendant that the crime of solicitation remains intact for a potential conviction. So, if you read that defendant has been found guilty of solicitation, you know that means it never turned into an agreement with another person. He could only be convicted if there wasn't any conspiracy to merge. One last point to consider with solicitation. It's the topic of failed communications. What happens when defendant tries to communicate a criminal request, but it never is received by the other person? I know this is going to sound like the old philosophy question. Does a tree make a noise when it falls in the forest if no one is there to hear it? Well, that's sort of what we have here. I want you to consider the following actual case. Defendant's in prison awaiting trial on molestation charges. Defendant writes his buddy from prison, and in the letter he asks his buddy to meet with the mom of the child he's accused of molesting. And defendant says to his buddy, "I want you to bribe her so that she pressures her child not to testify. Then I'm off the hook, I'll be acquitted." He writes this all out in this letter. He seals the letter, he gives it to someone inside the prison to mail. But you guessed it, the other inmate doesn't mail it. Instead, turns it over to prison authorities, who open the letter and found this request. The letter was never mailed, Buddy never received the request. Do you think this defendant should be guilty of solicitation to commit bribery, even though his buddy never actually received the communication? To figure this out, let's examine the different policies that might be in play. So on the one hand, you might say to yourself, well, wait a second, there was no actual request. There wasn't really an actus reus because it never got communicated to Buddy. The actus reus of solicitation requires that request, and if Buddy didn't receive the letter, how can a prosecution prove that the actus reus was met? That's really technically very true. Almost no harm, no foul. You didn't solicit because you didn't really get to do the ask, therefore there's no crime. On the other hand, you might be thinking, yeah, but defendant's dangerousness is shown by the letter. He wants Buddy to bribe the mom. His specific intent is clear from the letter, and he goes further than just muttering in his cell. He tries to communicate this request by writing a letter and turning it over to be mailed. As it turns out, these two opposing policies that I've just identified are actually at the center of the split in jurisdictions. Jurisdictions look at this differently. Under the common law, which is followed in some states. The communication has to be received for it to fulfill the actus reus requirement of solicitation. Without receipt, there isn't any actus reus because we have no real request or asking or encouragement, and therefore there's no solicitation. Okay, so that's one view. The common law says if Buddy didn't receive the letter, no solicitation. The Model Penal Code, which we have talked about in other lectures, they have a completely different viewpoint. It's all about the dangerousness of our defendant. The Model Penal Code section 5.02 states the following: it is immaterial that the actor fails to communicate with the person he solicits if his conduct was designed to affect such communication. I want to repeat that. If his conduct was designed to affect such communication, he's going to be guilty of solicitation. So in a jurisdiction that follows the Model Penal Code's view on solicitation, this broader view, prosecution's going to argue that defendant, by writing the letter, giving it to another person to have mailed, was actually conduct that was designed to affect the communication. He was trying for Buddy to receive it. And if that's true, defendant would be guilty of solicitation even if the letter never reached Buddy.